Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another session of spoken word storytelling on the Gloucester Folk Trail. I'm Chloe of the Midnight Storytellers, and tonight's set is a set of tales of Gloucester, the Cotswolds, and the West Country. And I'm dedicating tonight's performance to my friend, the poet Mickey Byrne, who died yesterday. Now, I've got so many stories from this part of the world, and of course, there's never enough time to tell them all. So geographically, I'll be jumping around, and we may get a white cat wandering through at some point. You know what it's like with these Zoom sessions. For those of you who haven't heard much storytelling before, I will, as we go along, talk a little bit about how I work this, and how I collect my material, and how I adapt it for my own purposes. One or two trade secrets might slip out. And of course, this is the very start of my deferred 20 years of tales tour. At last, it's getting going in a way that I really never expected. So let's start right in the city of Gloucester. Back in the days when the tall ships filled the docks at Gloucester. And in that time, there was a young shipwright. He was a superb craftsman. He was the kind of craftsman who knew almost by instinct, never mind his training and experience, he knew exactly which kind of wood to use for what task. And of course, with all the sailing ships in the docks, he was pretty busy most of the time. But when things went quiet, he'd take commissions. And one time, the mayor of Gloucester came to this young man and commissioned him to build a fancy little rowing boat for the mayor's wife for her birthday. You know, the clinker built with a little carved transom at the back. Oh yes, I know some of the vocabulary for this. And there was a date for delivery, and everything was agreed. And the young man set to work. And it was all going so well until there was one last bit of that pretty little rowing boat to finish, and he ran out of wood. He needed a particular well-seasoned length of oak, about, well, actually probably longer than that, but my hands will disappear. So if you imagine, if you hold your arms out wide to full length, that's the piece, that's the length of the piece that he needed. And of course, he asked around all the shipyards and the workshops in Gloucester, and do you think they had the wood he needed? No, of course not. And the deadline was creeping up on him. Those of you who are self-employed, you know how this feels. He decided there was just one thing left to do. He had to go himself out to the Forest of Dean, to the wood yards there, and see if they had the wood he needed. So he got a lift on a cart. He went out to some of the villages and the wood yards that he knew. And do you think they had the wood he needed to finish that rowing boat? Well, no, of course not. And by the time he'd gone round to several different places, the day was getting on, and he was cold, and he was hungry, and he was thirsty, and he was desperate to find this piece of wood. He started to walk among the trees, literally looking on the ground, looking under the trees for a fallen branch that was the right length and the right kind of seasoned oak to do the job. And dusk was falling, the mists were rising, the owls were hooting. He was getting quite anxious, but he was determined to find this piece of wood. He walked and he looked and he looked and he walked, looking on the ground, not looking where he was going. And as the moon rose, he realized he was completely and utterly lost. And it really was very spooky out there on his own in the forest, until he saw in the distance through the trees a square of yellow light. There was someone's home. And being a sensible young man, he hurried towards that square of light. And in a few minutes, he came to a clearing, and in the clearing was a cottage with smoke rising from the chimney. And yes, light showing out of the windows, the front door wide open. And on the front doorstep stood a little old lady with straggly grey hair and a nose that curved down and a chin that curved up. And the moment that the young man stepped into the clearing, she said, "Hello, dearie. We've been waiting for you. Come on in." Well, she obviously wasn't from Gloucestershire by the sound of her voice. I'll get it right in the next 20 years or so. The young shipwright was ready to run for his life, but just at that moment there wafted out of the open doorway the smell of good food. Most of you will know that the way to a man's heart is through his belly. He went in, and in the kitchen there was a kitchen table and two more old ladies with bright, birdy, beady eyes and noses that hooked down and chins that curved up. They were very welcoming, and they sat him down at the table. He had 4 helpings of a good stew and fresh bread and butter. And then he was full. He'd been walking all day in the fresh air. He was so tired. And one of the old ladies said, "Well, don't you worry. We've got a spare bed in the back of the cottage." I don't know where she came from either. "You can stop the night here." And she took a candle and she showed him to a tiny little room at the back of the cottage, in which there was a bed piled high with comfy looking blankets and pillows. And then out she went and left him, and she took the candle with her. So he had to make his way around the room in the moonlight, coming in, slanting down through the tiny little window. And as he went round the end of the bed, he saw there was a carved wooden chest. It must have been new oak. It was very pale. It almost gleamed in the silvery moonlight. And being a wood craftsman, well, he wanted a closer look, as he realized as he bent over it, it was carved all over. And he got closer and wished he hadn't. Because carved all over the pale wood of that chest were brambles and coiling, thorny, twisting branches. And in among and half hidden behind the thorns and the coils were sharp little faces with slanting eyes and fangs. You couldn't tell if they were man nor beast. And just looking at those carvings made shivers go down his spine. But, oh, he was so tired. He kicked off his boots, he jumped into bed, he rolled himself up in the blankets, and in 2 minutes he was... But not for long. Barely an hour had passed when he heard the sound of the bedroom door opening, and he peered in affright over the edge of his blankets. It was one of the old ladies tiptoeing into the bedroom, but she wasn't looking at him. She went straight to the chest at the end of the bed. She lifted up the lid. That was the lid, not the old lady. And she reached inside, took something out and put it on her head. And she whispered, standing in the full moonlight, she whispered, "By sage and by rue, by my green cap too, take me to Gloucester." There was a swirl of silver and emerald sparks around her, and she vanished from right there in front of him. And his heart went pitter-patter, and he was just about calming down when, guess what happened next? The second old lady came in. Creak. And then the floorboards, squeak, 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 squeak. Again, it was the floorboards, it wasn't the old lady. Actually, I should have gone the other way. She went to the chest, took the whatever it was out, put it on her head, said the words, and vanished. Guess what happened next? You got it. The third old lady came in, put something on her head, sparks, words, sparks, and vanished. So this left our hero all on his own in a scary old cottage right in the middle of the rather spooky at night Forest of Dean. He put his boots on and laced them up faster than I can tell you about it. And he was ready to run for his life. Except then his curiosity woke up. What was going on? What was in that chest? He had to find out. So, and it took some courage. He went to the chest and he opened the lid, and of course that blocked the moonlight coming in from the window. So he had to reach down into darkness inside that chest and feel around. Soft, woolly, warm. It was a woolly winter hat in moss green wool. All right. Nothing happened. The words. By sage and by rue, by my green cap too, take me to Gloucester. And the world spun around him. He felt as if his insides were being twisted and stretched, and there were sparks flying across in front of him. And then he landed somewhere completely different. And the somewhere completely different had sawdust on the floor, and there was a smell of beer in the air, and there were people laughing and talking, and there was music. He was in the Old New Inn in Gloucester, probably the oldest pub in the city. And there on the far side of the room was the table with the three old ladies, and they waved him over. And he went to join them, and they smiled, and they put a tankard of ale in front of him, so he drank that down because he needed to settle his nerves. And then they were eating another supper, and as a young man, well, he couldn't refuse, so he joined them in that. And then the music got going, and all day you've been hearing how wonderful that is. You can't resist. He couldn't resist the old ladies. Well, let me tell you, just because you get classed as an old lady, just because your hair goes silver, doesn't mean you want to stop dancing. All of the old ladies wanted to dance at least twice or even 3 times, and that meant the young man had to dance with all of them. And after that, there was more beer, and quite a lot more beer. And then he got to that point of the night, which I suppose you're all too clean living all ever to have done this. That moment where he suddenly felt really, really tired. And he thought if he put his head down on the table for a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and have a little nap, then he'd be good to party all night. Well, that was the plan. He put his head down, but he didn't sleep just 20 minutes. It was the next morning when he was being shaken awake, and it was the pub landlord wanting to be paid for all the beer and all the food that the shipwright and the women had consumed the night before. Well, I'm not even, he certainly didn't have that much money with him. I'm not even sure he had that much money. They had, if you'll pardon the phrase in this story, they had pushed the boat out. And in those days, if you couldn't pay your bar bill, you were in dead trouble. He was dragged off to the magistrate. The magistrate sentenced him on the spot to be hung by the neck until dead. They put him in chains on his wrists, chains on his ankles, and they put him in the cart, and he went rattling off out of the city up to the gallows at Over. And there was the executioner waiting for him in the biting cold of the early morning. "Right, sir, let's be having you. What's your last request?" And our poor young hero, at the last possible moment, he remembered. He said, "Well, if you please, I'd like to die with my hat on." It was a blooming strange last request, but all right then. So the guards attached our hero's chains to the gallows tree so that he really couldn't get away. But then he was allowed to fish in his pocket, and he took out that woolly green hat and plunked it on his head. And as quickly and quietly as he could, he said, "By sage and by rue, by my green cap too, take me home." And the world spun around him. There were sparks flying across in front of his eyes. He felt as if he were being twisted and stretched. And then he landed somewhere else, and the somewhere else was his own workshop. Ah, his own workshop with the fresh sawdust on the floor, and his workbench with all his tools neatly laid out or hung in the racks on the wall. But as the magic had seized him and dragged him through the air, there had been all sorts of strange noises, screechings and wailings, and a loud crack. And when he looked, he realized he was still in chains on his wrists, on his ankles. And the other ends of the chains were attached to a huge long piece of the gallows tree, fine, strong oak, just the right kind of wood and just the right length for him to finish making the mayor's rowing boat for his wife's birthday present. Cheers. So there is a bit of a secret about the origin of that story, which I'm not going to tell you right now. In fact, I'm going to hold on to the secret of that one. You can ask me. If ever we should meet, I'll be delighted to tell you. If you follow my website, midnightstorytellers.co.uk, you can email me through that, or you can ask me through my Facebook page, Midnight Storytellers UK, brackets Chloe. And if you ask me on there, I'll be very happy to tell you the secret of that particular odd little story. The next story I want to do for you tonight, it's all the fault of the people in the pub at Minchinhampton. I mean, they told me this story 20-something years ago. So, I mean, if they told me the story, it's about Tom Long, the highwayman of Minchinhampton Common, it must be true. And the trouble with see, I used to go across Minchinhampton Common to Nailsworth. Actually, that was to go to storytelling evening classes. And going across Minchinhampton Common, for those of you who don't know it, it's a huge, wide open hilltop, clear open ground with some Roman earthworks and a ditch. And the farmers, it's proper common land, so the farmers leave out their cattle, sometimes their sheep, and at times there have been ponies loose on the common grazing. That's all allowed, and you do have to drive very carefully across there. And coming back from evening class late at night, it's the most magical place because the air is really clean and you can see a sky absolutely bursting with stars. It's as if the stars come right down to the ground. It's an odd optical illusion. But of course, being so high up that hilltop, you often get thick fog. And some nights coming back quite late on my own in the car, the fog was so dense I couldn't keep going, and I'd have to pull the car across to the side of the road and just sit there with my sidelights on and just wait until the fog cleared a bit so that I could continue. And then, of course, a huge shape would loom up beside the car. And I had to remind myself it was just a cow or something like that. It was far too easy to imagine that was something or somebody else, possibly the ghost of Tom Long, the highwayman, who used to rob travellers in coaches and carriages crossing the common. I was told he used to sit on his tall horse under the trees at the side of the common, and he would listen for the rumble of wheels and the clatter of hooves. The common carts he'd let go by, there was no money in those. But the lighter rumble of carriage wheels and the smart clip-clop of well-shod horses' hooves, then he'd pull his scarf up to hide his face. He would load and cock his flintlock pistol, gather up his horse's reins, and at just the right moment, he would spur down on the track right in front of the approaching vehicle. Stand and deliver! And I can assure you that when I do this on stage, most of the town will hear. He was a lot louder. He was a lot fiercer. He was terrifying. In those old days, quite a lot of the highwaymen, it was almost fun to be stopped by them. Some of them, a lot of them had once been gentlemen that had gone off to the wars. They'd been cavalry, perhaps, and they'd come back to find their families, thought them dead and gone and lost and given up on them and moved on. Or sometimes when they came home, their families were so deep in debt that no honest work was going to help them. And so they turned to being gentlemen of the road. But Tom Long was no gentleman. If you even thought about resisting him, he'd probably shoot you or club you with a heavy handle of his pistol. And then he'd take your money, he'd take your jewels, he'd even rip the lace from your collar and your sleeves, because in those old days, lace was as valuable as gold. And then he was gone. And he was clever at what he did. And also Tom Long was tall and broad-shouldered and carried himself with a swagger. He laughed loud and easy. So he had a wife who adored him. And for a handful of years, they lived really well. Now, I've been shown in Minchinhampton a cottage that is supposed to be where they live. It looks nothing from the lane. There isn't even a window in the wall along the lane. But apparently, when Tom Long and his wife lived there, they lived almost as well as the Lord and Lady of the manor. In a time when most people barely had a three-legged stool for furniture to sit by the fire and a straw mattress to sleep on, well, Tom and his wife, they had an actual dining table with chairs. They had a four-poster bed with heavy curtains to keep out the drafts and the mice. They could eat meat at least once a week. Of course, they had smuggled French brandy and wine. And in fact, they were doing so well, they could even afford the fashionable new drink of the day all the way from London. They were drinking coffee. And many was the night when Tom was out working that Mrs. Tom would sit by the hearth, stirring on the back of the range. There'd be a big pot of stew, keeping warm for when he came back. And down on the hearth, a little can of coffee simmering away. But Tom's reputation spread a little too far and a little too fast. And it was a night of thick, swirling fog. When Tom was after special prey. He sat on his tall horse under the trees at the side of the common, and the damp dripped down through the branches, trickling down the back of his neck. And he was listening for the heavy thundering of horses' hooves and the slow rumble of the mail coach wheels. This would be a rich prize. He'd been waiting for this one for a long time. And he heard them coming. Pulled up his scarf, prepared his pistol, gathered up his reins, spurred his horse down onto the track, and as the lead horses and the coach burst out of the fog towards him, "Stand and deliver!" And all the horses and the coach came to a gravel scattering, skidding halt. Tom spurred his horse towards them and just had a moment to think. That was easy. That was too easy. And even as he thought that, the covers over the top of the coach, where they normally kept the luggage, those covers were flung back, and there were 6 soldiers, 6 redcoats, who leapt to their feet, pistols and a blunderbuss. The 6 of them fired as one man, and Tom's horse reared up, and everyone saw the rider begin to fall from the saddle. The horse bolted, and as Tom fell, his spurred boot heel caught in the stirrup iron, and the last that anyone saw of him, he was being dragged along the ground, away into the mists and darkness. That night, Mrs. Tom sat up waiting for her husband to come back. Waiting and waiting, with the church clock chiming the hours, and midnight and gone, and owls hooting across the Nailsworth Valley, and still nothing. And then a clatter of hooves outside. Mrs. Tom ran out, and there was Tom's horse, reins trailing, saddle empty. She grabbed the reins, and as she soothed the animal, she realized that its mane and its neck and the saddle was sticky with blood. And Tom never came home that night, nor any other. Apparently the villagers of Minchinhampton were kind to Mrs. Tom. She was allowed to continue to live in the cottage, but all the fine furniture and everything had to be sold to keep her going. And they say that to the end of her days, she would sit up late into the night beside the range, at the back of which was a foul, mouldy old pot of rotten meat stew. And down on the hearth, there was a dried out, a desiccated can of coffee. And you may think, well, that's just one of those highwayman stories with a sad ending. But you see, the thing is, on those nights when I was held up in the fog, in my car on Minchinhampton Common, when I opened the window a little for some air, I got that smell of old cooking. I got that burnt scent of coffee that's been kept warm for far too long. And in the distance, from time to time, I know that I heard the sound of galloping hooves. Cheers again. All right. I'm looking in horror at my watch, seeing how fast the time is going. I hope it's going as quickly for you. Right, we're going to go south now, because I promised some West Country stories. Right, this is one that I was given recently. So thank you, Beth Webb, who had this story from the fabulous Somerset storyteller, Ruth Tongue. I mean, what a name for a storyteller, isn't it perfect? And this is a story from the Quantock Hills. in Somerset. So basically, if you go down the M5, go past Bristol, keep going, and then look to your right, there's some hills, and that's the Quantocks. And in the old days, the grown-ups would tell their children, now you be good when you're out and about, or old Tom will get you. And they didn't mean a highwayman. They meant old Tom, the magic white pony of the Quantocks. Yes, I know we're supposed to call a white horse or pony grey, but this was probably meant to be a fairy animal, and the fairy animals have white coats and red furred ears. That's how they described him. And emerald green eyes. The grown-ups would say to the children, you been bad, you been wicked, old Tom will get you. He'll stare at you with his green eyes and he'll turn you to stone. There was a woodcutter, lived in the Quantocks, and he had 2 children from his first marriage, a boy and a girl, and he'd married again. The stepmother and the 2 children didn't get on. The 2 children said nothing and kept out the way as best they could, because they could see that the new wife was making their dad happy. He smiled again, he laughed, he was whistling when he went off to work and when he came home. But when he was out of the cottage at work, the stepmother treated the children badly. She shouted at them. She found fault with them. They did their best to help around the cottage, and goodness knows there was plenty to do. There was firewood to be brought in. There was water to be found from the stream or the well. There was cleaning up to do. But they couldn't do a thing right, according to their new stepmother. And she said they were stupid. She said they were useless. She said they weren't worth the food put on the table in front of them. And when the woodcutter came home at the end of the day, she wouldn't stop scolding the children in front of him, and then turning to him and saying how wicked they'd been and how lazy they'd been and how rude to her they had been. And bit by day, by week, by month, she was turning the dad against his own children. And more often, anger came into his face when he looked at them. It came to winter, a hard winter, deep snow, hard ice, biting cold winds. The stepmother turned to the children with a strange sort of a smile. She said, your dad don't think much of you at the moment. Time you did something to remind him that you love him. Time you did something to please him. Do you remember he loves strawberries? So why don't you go out now and find your dad some strawberries? Here's a basket, and don't come back till it's full. And the children looked at each other and they said, but stepmother, it's the middle of winter. It's deep snow outside. We can hardly walk through it. That's not my problem, is it? You go and find your dad some strawberries and prove to him that you love him still. And maybe he'll think better of you. And the children wrapped themselves up in old sacking, and they stuffed their thin little shoes with straw, because they didn't have proper boots and they didn't have proper coats. They didn't really have gloves. They just wrapped bits of rag around their hands. And they set off. And the first flakes of another snowstorm were already coming down. And the sun was already low in the sky. In the summer, the children knew immediately where they would go up into the edge of the woods to find wild strawberries for their dad. And they went to that place and they scuffed away the snow. But of course, it was the middle of winter. There were no strawberries there. And as the dusk deepened and the snow started slapping into their faces, the children couldn't face going back. They couldn't face their stepmother. They couldn't face not giving their dad strawberries. So the children went on up through the woods and came out onto the open hilltops. And now the wind, the icy wind, was cutting into their faces. And the night was gathering. And as the snow swirled around them, and the children's fingers and toes and faces were numb with cold, they lost all notion of which way to go or what even to do. And they sank down into the snow, huddling together. And then they heard a trampling, a snorting, and they looked up in terror as a small wild pony came trotting out of the gloom towards them, shaking its mane. And they thought it's old Tom come to get us. But this was not a white pony. This was a little moorland pony, half covered in mud, basically. It trotted around them, lifting up its hooves high, snow flying off. And its backside was covered in mud, and it's all up its back and its neck. There was caked mud. And they couldn't see the color of its ears. They couldn't see the color. It had great big hairy hooves. And its eyes were large, brown, and kind. And it stopped, and it very gently nudged at them and snuffled a bit in that way that a kind pony has. And the children realized it wanted them to go with it, to follow it. And they were only too glad to get alongside it, the boy on one side, the girl on the other side, and they reached their icy fingers under the mane. It was a bit cleaner under there, and it was warm, so they hung on close, and the pony kind of walked them along back towards the edge of the woods. And when they got in to the start of the trees, they were a bit more protected from the blizzard. And the pony took them to where there seemed to be a huge bank of snow. And of course, it was gorse bushes that had been covered over. And when they got around the other side, a little further into the woods, it was really much more sheltered. There was snow going across the top, but they could crouch down. And then the children realized there were a lot of fallen branches around the clearing with good dry twigs, and they gathered them. And then at the end of this pile of gorse covered in snow, there was a stack of logs. Their own dad must have worked up there earlier in the season, and he'd stacked small logs there, perhaps not worth carrying down, and he'd left them there. And of course, the children had with them their pocket knives and their flints, their fire steels. They never went anywhere without them. So they got a little fire going, scraped sparks into dry grass, got a little golden yellow flame flickering, smoke curling, a crackle, and then warmth, lots of warmth. And they were using the logs, and the children huddled together. But still they were chilled right through, and they didn't think they would last the night. But that is when the little wild pony very delicately walked around behind the children. And in that comical way that a horse or a pony has, it went down on its knees and down on its rump and settled itself in right behind the children. And they realized that its belly was round and furry and warm like a cushion and clean enough and smelled of clean pony. And they leant back and cuddled together and cuddled into the whiteness of that belly, and they went to sleep, warm and safe all night. First thing in the morning, they woke, the pony was gone, they were cold again, but the storm had stopped. The sky was clear blue, there were even birds singing high in the branches. And the children got themselves up and were wondering where to go when they heard shouts, calls echoing up through the trees. Someone was coming up through the woods from the valley below, and they heard their names being called. It was their dad. He'd come looking for them. They shouted back, and a moment later, their dad ran to them across the clearing, flung his arms around them and hugged them close. But the stepmother had followed. And as soon as she got to the dad and the two children, she was scolding, she was berating. What do you think you are doing, you two? We were sick with worry all night. Your poor dad, he nearly had a heart attack. What do you think you were doing, insisting, going out to find strawberries at this time of year for your dad? Never heard such rubbish in all my days. It's the middle of winter. And she wouldn't stop. And the children tried to break in. They tried to say, but it wasn't our idea. You were the one who wanted us to go and get strawberries. But she was going on, and the children could see their dad's face clouding, darkening. They could see anger starting again. And at that moment, from deeper in the woods, there was loud neighing. And out came the white pony. No mud on it now, mane and tail flying clear. It trotted fast and hard, its little hooves with tufts of hair flying, pounding into the snow, scattering it in all directions. The dad and the children flinched off to one side. The stepmother couldn't move at all. She stared in horror as the white pony trotted straight up in front of her and stopped in a swirl of snow. And it neighed again. Its whole body shook with furious neighing as it stretched out its neck and its nose, and it stared at the stepmother. Behind the pony, the woodcutter and the two children thought they saw a flash of emerald green. And when they looked again, the pony had gone, and where the woman had been was a stone, a woman-sized stone. And that was the end of her. The dad hugged his children close and realized that old Tom had come to deal with the bad and the wicked. The woodcutter realized he'd married a bad lot. He realized old Tom had saved him, his children, and all his family. And as far as I know, they lived happily to the end of their days. And that is the story of old Tom, the white pony of the Quantocks. My goodness me. I've got so many more stories I want to tell you. Well, I'll have to come back another year. Or if you look at my website, midnightstorytellers.co.uk, if you look at my Facebook pages, I've got Midnight Storytellers UK brackets Chloe. I've also got the Dragon Whisperer, because that's what I do for family storytelling. Yeah, I can talk about dragons even more than ponies. So if you follow me on one of those things, you'll find out what gigs I'm doing. I'm hugely grateful to Gloucester Folk Trail for inviting me to perform. It's been a while since I've had a chance to get in front of a big live audience, what with one thing and another. So it's been an absolute joy. And I will finish with because you've been sitting there thinking her stories go on forever. Let me finish with the shortest ghost story in all England. And it goes like this. There were two men working in a field on a farm. And one of them stopped and stretched and said to the other, he said, here, you know all them stories about ghosts? It's a load of rubbish. I don't believe it. Them ghostesses, I don't believe it. And the other man straightened up and looked at him and he said, oh, don't he? And he vanished. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody. It's been an absolute joy to have you listening, and I hope we will see each other very soon. Cheers.